I'd like to start out episode 2 by saying that I was able to make a good amount of progress on this since the first video went up. And I've had a few lessons since then as well, so things are really starting to pick up steam here in the first draft. I wrote a lot, and then I cut a lot, and then now I'm sort of starting again. Even though I feel like I have made some progress, this is more in the big picture of kind of where I want this piece to go. Cutting this stuff is not something I generally like to do. It's almost painful. I mean, you write something down because you're attached to it in some way. It's a part of you, creatively speaking, and you want to see it grow and you want to nurture it so it can stand on its own 2 feet in the world. To cast it aside is like a forest fire. It's dreadful in the short term, but if the forest fire is naturally occurring, it can be beneficial for creative development. It's if the forest fire is lit by a couple of teens smoking out in the woods or something. You know, if it's a forest fire that doesn't occur by natural means, that's really where you run into issues. Because the equivalent of that will be getting rid of something that you actually like, and that you actually can do something with, and is actually good as an idea that works in the context of whatever art you're trying to create. So I'm a little bit skeptical of whenever I get rid of something, or feel like I have to get rid of something, because I'm always worried that I'm getting rid of something that I shouldn't get rid of. But I get rid of things like this so rarely that I know pretty much for certain whether or not something is a good idea or not. What I've cut is not the beginning and ending, which I still really like, but rather sort of some middle stuff that I wrote between the last episode and when I'm recording this. And I'm getting rid of that because I don't really find it particularly conducive to the direction I want to go with the form. Most of the progress I've made is I have a much better idea now of how I want to structure the form. I've really come to terms with that. So I have an A section that's eerie, that's what I've already created. I have a B section, which I have some ideas for, which is going to be much more agitated, which is going to be very violent and very rhythmically driven, which is a great contrast from the kind of rhythmic ambiguity and the avoidance of beats that I was talking about last week. And it's going to create a great contrast with the A section. And then in the C section, I'm going to have a sense of calmness and explosions of utter chaos that go on around that. And I'm going to get into a little bit more of how I want to structure this C section, because I think that's going to be the most dramatic part of the entire piece. And I am going to sort of still compose this piece piecemeal. I'm not aligned myself anymore with... I've not internalized the idea as much as I had last week of creating this arch structure. I found that to be just simply too unwieldy. So from there, I'll either go back to the B section of agitation or go straight back to the A section of just eeriness. I'm leaning more towards the latter, but I may include some recapitulation of the B section just to round things out or give it a sense of an arch structure or a quasi-arch structure, as opposed to just A, B, C, A. We'll see where the piece goes and how the C section lines up, but I feel like I can get from calmness to eeriness more so than I can get from calmness back to agitation to eeriness. But again, we'll just see where it goes. I like the idea of crafting an arch structure, but it's just unwieldy. For a piece like this, it has to be expressive and it has to be as emblematic of what I can do as possible on a compositional level. So it needs to be both interesting to listen to and it needs to be interesting from a formal perspective, which is why I wanted to include interesting things to do both on a micro level, which is what I was doing last week with analyzing the microtonal seventh chords and how those created a row that, if you got rid of the extra notes, turned into this interesting quasi-octatonic scale, as well as talking about a larger arch structure. But as it is, I think I'm going to only have to have an interesting theoretical basis for the small scale and not necessarily as much on the big scale. The form needs to be more controlled by my intuition than by some kind of pre-compositional process. The arch structure is just not right for this piece, and now that I've gotten rid of it, I feel like the blinders are off. I'm feeling a lot more free. There's still that element in there, but yeah, I just don't feel as bound to that anymore. I don't feel as if I have to adhere to this one formalized and rigid structure. And this is also giving me some wiggle room to make sections longer if I see fit. It's a good thing to have some wiggle room, especially when you're writing a piece where there is a time limit, where you want to use as much of the time as possible, but you don't want to run up into the time limit and then have to find a way to cut things out, or find a way to simply stop the piece before it naturally should. Because pieces that do that, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but pieces that do that, they always come across as if they're unfinished, or as if the composer had no idea how to end a piece. And I want to make sure I can utilize the ending that I have written that I really like, and still really like, in a way that makes sense within the context of whatever the rest of the piece ends up being. So, there are two main questions this week. One is that of contrast, and the other is that of proportionality. In terms of contrast, there is a sense of drama in the idea of going to some place and then coming back. So this goes back even to the classical era. So the sonata form emerged in that era, and it wasn't so much out of a strict adherence to the form. It's very telling that musicologists only called sonata form, quote, sonata form, after the era had long since ended. It wasn't a strict adherence to the form. It was a strict adherence to the artistic principle that was inherent in dramatizing emotion to a place, and then dramatizing the motion back from that place. So to classical composers, this was key area. It was 5 in major or 3 in minor, typically speaking. Going to other key areas had long been a feature of music. You saw that in Baroque music. You saw that even in some music of the late Renaissance. Especially, I'm thinking some Gabriele Canzoni, which have some striking harmonic shifts that sound like something straight out of Franz Schubert. It was a classical era that highlighted modulation as a formal device, and since they were using this formally, they often had very simple schemes. And this would also be dovetailed with what came to be known as topoi, which are Greek for topics. These would imitate operatic arias to popular songs, to the hunt, to the military, to storms, the Sturm und Drang style. For extra contrast, composers would vary the texture by adopting conventions that were associated with these particular topoi. And alongside using these different key areas, were able to create contrast to a place and contrast away from the place. They were highlighting and dramatizing the motion away from tonic and then back to tonic. This is certainly not sonata form in what I'm writing, and as applicable to this piece, there's certainly a sense of the same thing. The essence is the drama of highlighting a contrast. There's something to be said for a big whomping surprise that jump out of you out of nowhere, and that's what I plan to do with these explosions of chaos that I want in the third major section of the piece. But that's also sort of like saying that the only way a horror movie is scary is through jump scares. It's effective, but it gets old. You're not really going to make a good plot out of it. So you're not going to get a good piece by relying on a similar technique to get you from A to B to C and then back again. You can't just, boom, you're in a different section. I mean, after a while, it loses its effectiveness. It's not boom, it's more like a boom, you're there. I don't like that. So you have to find a way to get from one place to another in a way that's not just you're all of a sudden there. You have to set it up, and it has to be a natural flow. So good horror plays out the fears of the unknown, and great horror combines these two. So great horror has jump scares, but also has something else, je ne sais quoi. So I'm thinking of the Weeping Angels from Doctor Who, or Slender Man from the Marble Hornet series. They both really do this. They have these jump scares, but they're also playing off a fear of the unknown, something that might have a weakness but can't be stopped by human means. Which, there's not really a good equivalency in the piece that I'm writing now, but there is an equivalency in jump scares. I've also officially changed the title of the piece, it's the second time for those of you keeping score at home, to Bonfire of the Vanities, which I had mentioned last time as a possible title. And as promised, I have a little background on that and why I think it makes sense for the piece is going and how it's shaping up. It's a more interesting lens through which to view the piece than was the former title, Ghosts in the Light. I can't say, I can't promise for certain that I won't change it again, but I'm now far enough into the piece where the overall structure is really starting to take shape. It's like a building under construction where you can kind of sort of tell what's going to go there and if it's going to be architecturally interesting or at least architecturally sound. You just have to fill in the gaps in the superstructure. So the Bonfire of the Vanities was a real thing where items of worldly pleasure, including musical instruments, but also anything that was considered a vanity item or an item that caused sin, were publicly incinerated in Florence, Italy in 1497. How this relates to music has taken me in a very interesting creative direction, in that I can relish in the idea of burning off modernist compositional techniques I find distasteful and fundamentally unmusical, much as I burned off material I didn't like during the creation of the piece, as I mentioned earlier. Now, this is a little bit of a quagmire to get into and to properly explain, so I'm going to see if I can do my best. A chunk of modern music I see on YouTube, with or without the score, takes itself way too seriously for being pieces that boil down to a collection of weird sounds elicited out of different instruments in different and wacky time signatures. There's a lot of it. It doesn't constitute a wide breadth of modern classical music, but it constitutes a significant enough sliver that I feel as if it is doing more harm than good. It brings nothing new to the table, and I think it's usually self-indulgent and self-important in the way it comes across, because generally the composers who write in that style are not honest about, hey, I came up with some interesting ideas for sounds, unusual sounds that come out of these different instruments. Usually they're talking about, the nature of the universe or something that's much more highfalutin, as we'd say in the South. So composers who work exclusively in that extreme edge of modernism come across as extraordinarily pretentious, as if they have no valid artistic things to say, but yet are saying them anyway. And that's fine for someone like John Cage, who said, I have nothing to say and I am saying it, and that is poetry. But having all these imitators of John Cage and some of the new complexity composers, and having them just write these extreme pieces where playing a note on an instrument in a way that the instrument was intended to be used for is somehow avoided. I've heard a lot of pieces where, maybe I have a solo flute piece where there's no actual flute sounds in the entire thing. It might be sonically interesting, but that's the most you could possibly say about it. I don't think that its existence is good for music in general. And I would go so far as to say that the existence of, again, this small sliver of what constitutes modern classical music is harmful to the idea that the genre needs a revitalization that also incorporates living composers in a meaningful way. That's a bit of a tangent, but that all kind of had to do with contrast to some extent. So the other question I had was that of proportionality. And this is the main reason that I think I rely so heavily on narrative structures. Because more than anything, you have the proportions of a good story. When I don't have that, the best thing to do is just not think about it in an odd way. If you're not concerned with it and you're just trying to create something interesting in an improvisatory setting, you'll naturally move on whatever the music needs to move on, because you're hearing it in real time, and everyone has an inner sense of proportionality. Everyone has a sense of what they find aesthetically pleasing. But it's different for everyone, which is why everyone has different tastes in who they consider attractive. If I go to the piano and have a collection of phrases or gestures or sounds that I want to use, I can realize them on the spot. And effective improvisation is a stepping stone towards a composition. And using it as a stepping stone requires a previously worked out set of ideas or moods. Without it, improvisation is a fun exercise, but it's just that. It's just improvisation. It's like talking without having any idea of where you want it to go. There's no particular motive behind it. Having an idea of where you want to go and a glossary of points you like is the key to extemporizing a good and powerful speech, if you've had enough practice in the art of extemporizing speeches. Along the way, you might also find some things you really, really like and want to refine for use. If you've had enough practice with it, you can experiment in different iterations of this improvisation of how you incorporate things, where you incorporate these ideas, and by simply mixing and matching them in an improvisatory setting, you're creating a space in which you can freely integrate everything that you want to integrate, and then whatever you come up with, you can refine that and continue to refine that, and really, again, use this as a compositional tool. So I perform at my church, and I always use a hymn from the day as a basis for a prelude improvisation. Again, it's never just this spur-of-the-moment stuff, as much as someone might tell you otherwise. There is an entire art to improvisation, to the point that much music from non-Western cultures is based around improvisation, either in whole or in part. As it happens, about, I'd say, 95% or upwards of 95% of my improvisations end up with material I just don't like. But sometimes, especially after a long session of interleaved practicing and improvisation, I get to the point where I come across something that I really like. And I keep going with it as much as I can, and I repeat it as much as I can, and I recontextualize it as much as I can. And then I know it's good if I can recall it the following day, or if I can recreate it in some fashion, if I can, reach sort of an echo of what it was. Much of what went into the first movement of my first symphony was like this. Sometimes I come up with something and I can't remember it the next day. I might like it, but you just can't, you like something, but you can't come up with it again. That's another painful burning off for me, because I feel like if I don't remember something after a day has passed, then it's not my best work. It's not something that really will stick out in the listener's mind. Otherwise, it might be good music, but I've heard a lot of music where, I know that I liked it, but I can't remember a thing about it. I can't remember a tune from it. I might remember an interesting orchestration I heard, or wonder how the composer achieved such an effect, but I won't be able to remember an exact tune from it. And I want there to be some degree of memorable melodic line to it, because melody is such an integral part of our musical culture that even if it's not something you go out whistling or humming after the end of the concert, it's something that really sticks in your head. And so I think that's much more powerful than having just an interesting harmony, interesting chord progression, or an interesting orchestration. Realizing this into notation is just another level of reinterpretation. So a method I've used takes these ideas in the form of this loose improvisation, which if I'm happy with it, I record it, and then I chunk it up into sections using my recording software. And from there, it's a painstaking process of notating that measure by measure. And then once you see it within the notation software, you can then play that back with whatever MIDI function it has, listen to it, figure out what it would sound like within the ensemble, and make more edits from there. What I'm also doing right now is figuring out exactly how I want these chaotic explosions I mentioned to be. Figuring out exactly how this block sonority is going to form, how it's going to take shape, is something for which we're going to have to go to the piano. So welcome to the piano, where I'm going to do a little bit of live composition with how exactly I want to structure these big chordal moments. Now, first thing is I want to make sure that each instrument in the ensemble can play. So these are all going to occur at the same time. The second thing is I know that I want to pull the notes of this sonority out of this interesting scale that I came up with last week. So what I'm going to do first is on this blank sheet here, I'm just going to put it in C. So what I had is C, B flat, E flat, F sharp, G, A, now B flat. We're going to say probably either vibraphone or glockenspiel for the percussion here in this particular moment in the piece. I don't know exactly what yet. Actually, no. Come to think of it, bass drum might actually be a pretty cool effect, especially if hit with a hard wooden stick with a dead stroke. It might have a nice punch to it, because everything else is going to be pitched anyway. You want to use what you can of the ensemble. In this case, we're going to go with bass drum. and all subject to change. Some clefs in. You have your cello, you have your violin, you have your B flat clarinets, you're going to have your flute. So between these, you have 7 notes of the scale, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of individual staves. So the first question is, if you want to have as wide a range as possible, how do you get that? Well, first of all, you need to put something down in the lower register. So what I'm thinking is having something wide in the low register. Having something really tightly together, especially in the lower octave. Once you get below past this, I've warned you this is very out of tune, but it's good enough for my purposes. Once you get down past cello C, it really starts to become muddled. You can use the sonority if you really want it. Like the opening of my first symphony has that as an opening sonority on the cellos and the basses. If you want it, you have to know what you're in for. So if you want a muddy sound, that's what you're going to get. For this, you do want something that's more transparent on the bottom, so you can use smaller intervals when you go up, which is, I mean, that's a basic compositional technique. So what I'm thinking is using B flat and C on the bottom, just to some extent. I'm gonna go with a ninth just to be on the safe side and have a broader interval, just by a little bit. Major seventh, minor ninth. These are both really crunchy intervals, but they're also going to be very low. So when combined with everything else, you want to make some differences. What I like about the minor ninth is that you can have the C on the very bottom, which is what I'm going to put in now. But that does not have to be played by the piano. The cello could very easily play this, and instead of having these block sonorities up, where you have, well, these couple notes are by the piano, this is by the strings, this is by the piano again, this is by the winds. You can really interleave them to different extents. So I'm going to put this low C. Only the piano can reach that. I'm not going to call for a contrabass clarinet or something crazy. It's not a standard part of the Pierrot ensemble. And then I'm going to put the D flat here. I'm going to stick that in cello. So now we have. And the great thing is, since that is going to be played on the C string, you can have this open G if you want it. But you can also do a double stop in the cello. And it's a great ensemble, so you can call for whatever you want within reason, as long as it's physically playable. You don't have to worry about, is this idiomatic for so and so. You're more free and open. That's kind of what I was talking about last week. So if you got that, the next question is, what interval do you want to put on top of that from there? This is a really chunky interval. Let's get rid of those. It's a really chunky interval. So what you want is ideally a less chunky interval, so you don't put the real dissonant stuff down towards the bottom. You actually do have some consonant intervals mixed up in there to give it an interesting sound. It's almost too tonal because I hear those notes as like an F sharp chord in 6/4 position. So I don't like that combination. That's pretty interesting. I kind of like that. Unfortunately, it's some pretty chunky intervals in there. So if you take each note by itself, minor ninth, tritone, major seventh, get some chunky intervals in there. If you take every other note, you have a perfect fifth and an octave, and then you have a perfect fourth and an octave. So you do have some consonances in there, but they're interleaved. Can you see this? It's interleaved. Just making wild hand motions at this point. So if I really like that, I'm going to put that G in the cello. The F sharp, that's interesting because it could be played by the B flat clarinet. It could also be played by the piano, and I'm thinking kind of like that as on the piano. But if you do have the piano sound down here, you can't play these two notes and play something higher up in here if you really want a bright, sharp attack to it. So for now, I'm going to put the F sharp in there as the piano notes. So in the piano notes you have dissonance. Wait, is that right? Yeah, that's right. So in the piano notes you have a tritone, and in the middle you have cello notes that have a tritone. So it's kind of an interleaved orchestration. What I don't like so much about this is that if you really want a bright pop towards the top, you can't necessarily use the bass drum. So what I'm thinking is that I might end up with a couple of different iterations of the same sonority, a couple of different ways to organize these notes in this block sound that's just this punch, and I can use these different punches in different ways. But for now, let's just go with this. So let's get rid of those two notes. So now, in the violin and the B flat clarinet and have the flute, the notes we have left to use, we have this group, which is conveniently also, this is called a Viennese trichord. And in set theory, which is a way of analyzing atonal music, this is a particularly interesting set because it has two very powerful dissonances in it. You have the minor second, and you have the tritone. So we're going to have another tritone stuck in here, and I'd like to switch it up and not have that played by the same instrument. And also, since we have piano, cello, cello, piano, I want to stick in something of let's say the B flat clarinet. You want to say the flute for something higher up because you also want to write something for registers in which these instruments can really dig into it. You write low flute's going to get obliterated. And I'm not sure if this is going to be a part of the piece where I can have piccolo. I might, I don't know. But I'd rather stick to flute right now because it does keep your options a little more limited, and you have to think through things a little bit more. Because I don't know where the context of this is going to end up. So they have these three notes. What I like about the B flat here is that it's actually fairly consonant with all the notes presented so far. It's the harshest dissonance is actually between that and the D flat of the cello. So that's 2 octaves and a major second. That's one of the part that doesn't really sound like a dissonance to me. I mean, at this point, a major second doesn't sound really like super dissonant to my ear. It's still got a bit of instability, but it doesn't have a real bite to it. So I'm just going to say, I'm just going to put the E flat in the B flat clarinet, because I think that would really work. It's kind of a lower note. It's not really that shallow mode register, which characterizes the low end of the flute. Sorry, the characterizes the low end of the clarinet, rather. But it's it's a nice color. So now we have these two notes. That's going to be interesting. I kind of like that, actually. I kind of like that sound. It almost has this Lydian quality. And I do love me some Lydian mode. So let's put that on the top. It's a really that's a harsh dissonance, like earlier. It's that major seventh. But contextualized with the E flat below it, the D flat and the A don't really sound nearly as bad. I'm going to put the A on the top because the flute is really nice above the staff. It really, boom, it cuts through. And then, which leaves the B flat for the violin. So as a sonority, you have which obviously you can't play all at once, but that's sort of how I go about figuring out how I want this to resolve itself. So this is going to be all accented, this one big walloping sound, and then I have to find some way of contrasting that with a moment of calm. So let's just add this bass drum note in there. What I think is an interesting way of eliciting calm is by going to a completely different kind of sound world that you're not using in this sound at all. So in this case, the way this is shaping up with this particular transposition of this 7-note quasi-octatonic scale is that the missing note is an E. So you go from this sonority to just an E. First of all, you have that's your piano sound. So then the piano sound jumps up to here, which is almost completely different. And what I could do is I could say make this fortissimo, obviously, and then have that followed up by going to this E octave, una chord. The soft pedal on this piano has never worked, but if it did, you'd have this real change in color from that dark sound, which, by the way, also, now that I'm playing it, sort of has that Lydian quality. You want that to descend towards the E, but the E never comes because it's not part of the chord. You don't hear a resolution as part of this sonority. Can you hear? It's a little bit of that tension and then resolution, but it jumps up. You also have, from the flute, this jump of a fourth, or fifth, rather, whichever direction you're going to go. Or from the clarinet, which is just an octave added to like a D sharp going to E. In this case, it's spelled as an E flat, but it's enharmonic D sharp up to E. With cello notes, it really doesn't work so well. But everything else, I think it really contrasts. Each note has some kind of reference to E, even though E is not part of it, and then it comes to E in a completely different tone color, and it's a nice way of eliciting some moments of calm. Now, of course, if there's a bass drum that's part of this, you could always switch to, like, bowed vibes, and then have that as an E as well. Or alternatively, like, maybe an F sharp. But if you want some calm and you want some emptiness after this big walloping sound. I think it might be better to just go to octaves. But that's sort of my plan. But so that's a little bit of a look into how I go about writing sort of on the spot, figuring out what's going where. And I have an idea, but in the process of I'm figuring out these relationships between notes and how I want these things to sound. So this might not be the only way I go with it. This might not be the way I go with it at all. I might have a couple of different iterations of this. But this is the same process that I'll go with for every single time that I want to use these big punching chords. Because I want these big surprises to have a link in the midst of what's otherwise fairly calm. So, that's about it. Tune in next week and hopefully I've actually used this in a piece.